The Long Horizon, a decade of Brexit. The story of the United Kingdom and the European Union is not one of a single moment, but of a slow, rhythmic tide that has pulled at the shores of the British Isles for over half a century. To understand the decade between 2016 and 2026 is to witness one of the most profound structural shifts in the history of modern statecraft. It is a narrative built upon the quiet scratching of pens on historic treaties, the thunderous echoes of the House of Commons, and the intricate, often invisible webs of trade that sustain a modern economy. To begin, we must look at the landscape of the early 2000s. The relationship was functional, yet strained by a growing sense of divergence. The United Kingdom had always been a somewhat restless member of the European project, an island nation with a global history, often looking across the Atlantic as much as it looked across the Channel. While it was a central pillar of the single market, it had famously opted out of the euro and the Schengen Agreement. By 2013, the internal pressures within the ruling Conservative Party, coupled with the rising electoral threat of the UK Independence Party, reached a breaking point. Nigel Farage, the primary architect of this external pressure, was a figure who understood the power of simple, resonant messaging. For years, he had utilised his seat in the European Parliament not to legislate, but to critique the very institution from within. His rhetoric centred on a singular concept: sovereignty. He spoke to a sense of lost agency, arguing that the British people had become subjects of a distant bureaucratic superstate. His influence was such that Prime Minister David Cameron, seeking to settle the Europe question and secure his own party's unity, promised a simple in or out referendum. It was a gamble that would redefine the nation. The campaign of 2016 was a study in contrasts. The Remain camp, led by the machinery of the government, focused on the known knowns of economic stability. They produced voluminous reports on the benefits of the single market and the risks of a leap into the unknown. Opposing them was the Leave campaign, which found its most potent voices in Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. They distilled complex constitutional grievances into the slogan, "Take back control." Boris Johnson, with his peculiar blend of classical erudition and populist optimism, painted a picture of a global Britain that would be unburdened by European regulation, free to chart its own course in the world. On the 23rd of June, 2016, the British public turned out in record numbers. As the results began to filter through in the early hours of the following morning, the geographical and social fractures of the country became visible. London, Scotland and Northern Ireland voted heavily to remain. The industrial heartlands of the north, the Midlands and the coastal towns of the south voted decisively to leave. At 4:40 a.m, the result was called. The United Kingdom had voted to leave the European Union by 51.9%. The shock was seismic. David Cameron's resignation followed almost immediately, setting the stage for one of the most challenging periods of governance in British history. Theresa May, who stepped into the vacancy, was a politician defined by a sense of duty and a penchant for meticulous, if sometimes rigid, process. She had been a quiet supporter of the Remain side, but her premiership was dedicated to the mantra, "Brexit means Brexit." She faced the unenviable task of translating a binary vote into a complex legal reality. In early 2017, she delivered her Lancaster House speech, which set out the red lines that would define the coming years. The UK would leave the single market to end freedom of movement, and it would leave the customs union to regain the power to strike its own trade deals. However, these red lines collided head-on with the delicate peace on the island of Ireland. The 1998 Good Friday Agreement relied on an invisible border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. If the UK left the EU's customs and regulatory orbit, that border would technically become an external frontier of the Union, necessitating checks on goods. To avoid this, May's team negotiated the backstop, a mechanism that would keep the entire UK in a customs union with the EU until a technical solution for the border could be found. This backstop became a lightning rod for criticism. To many leavers, it felt like a trap that would leave the UK as a vassal state, bound by rules it no longer helped to write. For 3 years, the British Parliament was characterised by a state of agonising deadlock. The meaningful votes on May's deal were repeatedly defeated, often by historic margins. The country watched as the House of Commons became a theatre of procedural warfare, with the Speaker, John Bercow, often at the centre of the storm. The mental and political toll was immense, and by the summer of 2019, Theresa May, unable to find a path through the impasse, resigned in tears. The arrival of Boris Johnson in Downing Street signalled a shift in tone and strategy. Where May had been cautious, Johnson was assertive. He promised to get Brexit done, a phrase that resonated with a public weary of the seemingly endless constitutional debate. Johnson's breakthrough came in his willingness to do what May would not. He agreed to a border in the Irish Sea. This meant that Northern Ireland would effectively remain within the EU's single market for goods, while the rest of the United Kingdom diverged. This Northern Ireland Protocol removed the immediate obstacle to a withdrawal agreement. After a decisive victory in the December 2019 general election, Johnson had the numbers he needed. On the 31st of January 2020, the United Kingdom legally left the European Union. It was a moment of quiet gravity. The Union Jack was lowered in Brussels, and the UK entered a transition period, a year of stasis where everything remained the same while the long-term trade relationship was negotiated. These negotiations took place during the unprecedented global upheaval of the COVID-19 pandemic. Negotiators David Frost and Michel Barnier were forced to conduct much of their work via video screens, debating the minutiae of fishing quotas and level playing field requirements from their respective capitals. It was not until Christmas Eve of 2020 that a deal was finally struck, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, TCA. The TCA was, by any historical measure, a thin trade deal. While it allowed for tariff-free and quota-free trade in goods, it introduced significant non-tariff barriers. From the 1st of January 2021, the frictionless trade the UK had enjoyed for 4 decades vanished. Businesses were suddenly required to navigate a forest of customs declarations, rules of origin certificates, and sanitary checks on food and animal products. Small businesses in particular found the administrative burden daunting. The reality of being a third country meant that a simple shipment of cheese or machinery now required hours of digital and physical paperwork. The cultural impact was equally palpable. The end of freedom of movement meant that the automatic right of British citizens to live and work in Europe, and vice versa, ceased to exist. For young people, the loss of the Erasmus Plus exchange programme was a particularly stinging blow, replaced by the UK-only Turing scheme. The labour market began to shift as industries that had relied on European workers, such as social care, hospitality, and agriculture, faced significant recruitment challenges. As the 2020s progressed, the political volatility in Westminster continued. Boris Johnson's tenure ended in 2022, followed by the brief, tumultuous premiership of Liz Truss. Her mini-budget, which aimed for a radical dash for growth through tax cuts and deregulation, was viewed by many as the ultimate ideological expression of a certain type of Brexit. However, the market reaction was catastrophic, leading to her resignation after just 49 days. Rishi Sunak, her successor, brought a more pragmatic, technocratic approach to the post-Brexit landscape. He recognized that the friction over the Northern Ireland Protocol was poisoning the wider relationship with Europe. In early 2023, he secured the Windsor Framework, which sought to ease the burden of the sea border. It introduced green lanes for goods staying in Northern Ireland and red lanes for those destined for the Republic. It was a technical fix for a technical problem, and it marked a significant thawing in relations between London and Brussels. Under Sunak, the UK also began to find its feet in the world of independent trade. It joined the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, a massive trading bloc in the Indo-Pacific, signalling a tilt away from the European continent toward the faster-growing economies of the East. However, the economic reality remained complex. By 2024, the Office for Budget Responsibility noted that the UK's trade intensity was significantly lower than its peers, and business investment remained sluggish. The general election of July 2024 brought Sir Keir Starmer to power with a massive mandate. Starmer, a man who had built his career on forensic legal analysis, took a very different stance on the European question. He accepted that the UK would not return to the single market or the customs union. The political scars of 2016 were still too fresh for that, but he argued that the existing deal was too thin and needed to be improved. The Starmer years, leading up to 2026, have been defined by a policy of "make Brexit work." This has not been a period of grand constitutional drama, but of quiet, diligent resetting. One of his first actions was to seek a comprehensive veterinary agreement to reduce the need for physical checks on food exports, a move that provided much-needed relief to the British farming sector. He also oversaw the UK's successful reintegration into Horizon Europe, the EU's flagship research programme, allowing British scientists to once again collaborate on the cutting edge of global innovation. In late 2025, a landmark security pact was signed, deepening cooperation on everything from energy security to cross-border crime. This was born of a recognition that in an increasingly unstable world, the geographical proximity of the UK and the EU necessitated a close, functional partnership. As we look at the state of the nation in early 2026, the long decade of Brexit appears as a story of adaptation. The fierce, polarized arguments of 2016 have largely given way to a more sober, practical discussion about the future. The United Kingdom is now a nation with its own regulatory bodies, its own immigration system, and its own trade policy. It has diverged in areas like digital regulation and gene editing, seeking to carve out niches of competitive advantage. Yet, the proximity of the European Union remains the defining fact of British economic life. The 2026 review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is currently underway. This is a formal, scheduled moment for both sides to look at the operation of the treaty and decide where it can be strengthened. The current government is pushing for deeper cooperation in professional qualifications, aiming to make it easier for British architects, lawyers, and musicians to work across the continent. The economic landscape in 2026 shows a country that is slowly recovering its balance. While the Brexit shock was real and measurable, particularly in terms of food inflation and business investment, the predicted total collapse of the economy did not occur. Instead, the UK has entered a period of slow-motion realignment. Trade with the EU remains significant, but the non-tariff barriers have become a permanent part of the cost of doing business. Politically, the landscape has also settled into a new pattern. Nigel Farage remains a vocal presence, now leading Reform UK from the benches of the House of Commons, acting as a constant reminder of the original insurgent spirit of 2016. On the other side of the aisle, the Labour government under Starmer continues its methodical work of rebuilding bridges, one technical agreement at a time. The decade has taught the nation that sovereignty is not a destination, but a constant demanding process of negotiation. The control that was taken back in 2016 is now being exercised every day in the civil service offices of Whitehall and the committee rooms of Westminster. It is a more complex, less certain world than the one that existed before the referendum, but it is one that the United Kingdom is learning to navigate with a new sense of pragmatism. As the sun sets over the Channel in early 2026, the ferries continue their crossings, carrying goods and people between two entities that are now legally separate but remains inextricably linked by history, geography, and mutual interest. The story of Brexit is no longer a headline-grabbing crisis, but the quiet, ongoing work of a nation finding its new place in an ever-changing world. The 2026 review is just the latest chapter in that long-running story, a story that, like the tide itself, continues to move and shift with the passage of time. In the small towns and great cities, the impact is felt in the steady evolution of the high street, the changing makeup of the workforce, and the new regulatory stamps on the products we use every day. It is a granular, lived experience. The global Britain envisioned by Boris Johnson and the make Brexit work pragmatism of Keir Starmer are two sides of the same coin. an island nation's attempt to reconcile its independent spirit with the realities of a globalized economy. The individuals who shaped this decade, Farage, May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak and Starmer, will all be judged by history, not just for their rhetoric, but for how they managed the immense machinery of change. Some sought to break the old system, others to manage the transition, and others still to fix what was broken in the aftermath. Each has left an indelible mark on the constitutional fabric of the country. And so, as the technical discussions of the 2026 review continue in the quiet rooms of Brussels and London, the United Kingdom moves forward. The questions of the last 10 years have been answered, but they have been replaced by new ones. Questions of growth, of productivity, and of the UK's role as a bridge between the Atlantic and the European continent. The long decade is over, but the work of the new era is only just beginning. The quiet resilience of the British economy and the slow, steady shift of its political institutions suggest that the nation is finding a new equilibrium. It is a quieter time now, a time for the steady application of policy rather than the fiery speeches of the campaign trail. The white cliffs remain. The sea remains, and the relationship across that sea, though changed forever, continues to evolve, as it always has and always will. The 2026 review will be concluded, new agreements will be reached, and the story will continue to unfold, one day at a time, into the future.